we are here with Little Miss Funeral, or her name is Lauren. So I'll probably say Lauren rather than Little Miss Funeral every time. Or I can do LMF or something. Like, do you have a?
Lauren's fine. You can say Lauren because Little Miss Funeral is definitely a mouthful.
Yeah,
So
I feel like it's like your rapper name or something. Like, I
that's
don't know.
perfect.
So we are going to answer 10 questions with Little Miss Funeral and Kari, and we're going to do a series of videos. So we're going to do at least 3 of these videos to answer questions because you guys have given us so much to answer, which is awesome. So we're going to just dive right in. Now, the first question is, how would you handle if you were personally prefer direct cremation for yourself and your family wants a more traditional service for you? So if, Lauren, you want just direct cremation for yourself and your family wanted a service, how would you handle that kind of with them while you're still here, I guess, in the planning stage?
I feel like I have such a different outlook on this question just because I do work in the funeral industry.
Right.
I feel like if I wasn't a funeral director, my mentality would be, well, whatever I want is what I want, and that's what my family has to do. But because I'm a funeral director and because I see how people go through grief and when they lose a loved one, I would kind of look at it and say, why do I want a direct cremation? Do I want it because it's easier for my family? Do I want it because it's less expensive for my family? And I would kind of talk with them and find out why they would want the services that they want. Do they want to view me when I'm deceased? Will that help them through their grief and through, that whole process? And I would kind of just talk with my family and try to come to like a happy medium. Like maybe say, okay, you want to view me when I pass away because it's going to make it easier for you. So I'm okay with having a private viewing with my family and then the cremation afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, that's one big thing I have always said is, you have to ask the question, like, this is what I want, but what do you need? Because
Yeah.
when you're dead, you're gone, and it's your family that has to live on with after you. And so it's, what is going to be good for them? Like, what do they need to go on that next step? If you getting kind of burned up and stuck in the closet doesn't really work for them, then what do they need? And maybe find, like you said, that happy medium where they can have the viewing, but then in the end, you're still getting your cremation. It works for both of you in the end.
Yeah, it's kind of like that thought process. Funerals are for the living, not for the dead.
Right, right.
You know.
So David had this question. I've heard, and I always took this with a grain of salt, that after an autopsy, the organs are not returned to the body, but are supposedly bagged and stored in a compartment of the casket at the feet. I don't actually believe this, but I think that's a belief that's out there, or maybe that's a thing. So what's the real story? Are the organs stored at the feet of the casket of the deceased, or is this just an urban legend? You can go ahead and answer, and then, yeah.
Okay. So basically, anytime we get an autopsy body, well, when you're doing an autopsy, first and foremost, it is a very extensive procedure. It's not just like a little cut here or there. They're trying to find out the cause of a passing. So they're doing a lot of tests. They're doing a lot of different procedures to find out. So when they're removing a person's organs, which they do during an autopsy, they're returned then to the funeral director inside of their cavity, but they're in a plastic bag or something. It's not like the autopsy technician is going to be putting everything back where it came from right after the process. So when we do the embalming process, then we do need to remove those organs from the cavity in order to access the arteries and everything to treat and embalm a person. Now, every single time I've dealt with an autopsy body after the embalming and I treated the organs the appropriate way, we would put them back then in the person's cavity and suture them up. I do, however, know that I've heard of other funeral directors who would not return them to the person's cavity for whatever reason. They were nervous that maybe it would leak or something like that for a funeral. So they would sometimes put them at, the foot of the casket, but it's always with the person. It's not like a funeral director is going to keep the organs off to the side.
Like, why would we want those?
Yes. They are going with the person. So every single time I've treated a body like that and done embalmings, they always go right back in the cavity, and it's all in the
So when you put them back in the cavity, are you putting them in the bag in the cavity, or do you?
Yeah, I would always put it in the
Take
bag.
them out? Because some funeral directors will they call it breading.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
they take all the viscera, they take actually out of the bag, and they coat them in a paraformaldehyde powder. So it's basically a powdered form of formaldehyde. So they bread them and then they put them back in. And people refer to it like a shake and bake, because that's what it looks like, is when you shake and bake a piece of meat, they're kind of breaded in that, and then you put them back in the cavity, so they're not in the bag. And some people will do that so that you don't have any of that fluid that's in the bag, that if the bag does get punctured by, getting snagged on a rib or something else, then they don't leak. So some people do that. And I know some people, if they can't fit all the viscera back in the cavity, they will put some in a bag at the foot of the casket. And some funeral directors refer to it as the BOG and the BOC, the bag of guts and the bottom of the casket. I don't even know. This is just, and I don't know many that do this, but I just heard this. And it's so trite and silly, really, that is. But what I have heard recently is that somebody did this and they put the bag of viscera on the foot of the casket. Well, a worker at the funeral home, when the family came to get the person's personal belongings, grabbed that bag and gave it to them.
Oh my God.
Because it was a dark colored bag. It was because hospitals, sometimes they use those red biohazard bags for everything, whether it's viscera or whether it's, the clothing. So the person got out to the car, opened it up, and there's guts and lungs and everything. And so a huge lawsuit. And so that's why funeral directors are being pretty fastidious about, is that the right word, fastidious, about, putting everything back in the person rather than using that foot space anymore. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. But the BOG and the BOC, crazy. So Jerry wants to know, after embalming and placed in the casket with the vault, does your body ever return to dust? And how long does it take?
I feel like this is such a difficult question because there are so many different aspects to it. Like, one, how good is your embalmer? Right. Not necessarily how good is your embalmer, but like at what percentage are you embalming a person? Number two, the casket and vault. Are they sealed or are they non-sealed? Basically, do they have a gasket that goes around them to form an airtight seal? Or are they non-gasketed, where when you place them in the ground, earth and water and elements are getting into that?
Right.
Obviously, if you're going to be, well, maybe not obviously, that's like a bad word, but if you're going to be burying somebody in the ground in a non-sealer casket in a non-sealer vault, they are going to decompose much quicker than somebody were to, say, be in like a gasketed, airtight seal casket. So I feel like that's just such a difficult question.
Kind of, how long is somebody going to be preserved? Like, there's just, the water table comes into factor, and is it clay? Is it sandy? Is it, it's all about what that environment is under the ground, because it all affects it. And I think some of that old turn back into dust came back when it was, the old wooden boxes, and the ground could collapse in around you and you could become dust essentially again. But there's not that regeneration unless you're doing a green burial nowadays. So it's, thousands of years of decay and everything out before you can get there, I think. But
what did the person pass away from? How quickly were they embalmed after they did die? What kind of an environment are they, or climate are they living in? Is it a warmer, drier climate that their body is held in? I mean, there's so many different factors that can go into that question too. Right.
If you're up here in the north where it's cold and half the year it's essentially refrigeration half the year, but then you get down to warmer climates where it's moist and it's warm and it's just breeding decay under the ground. So it's like you got two polar opposites. So it's like you said, where and all the factors into it. Have you ever had a family member asked to be present during embalming?
I have once, but the person who asked to be present was actually a licensed funeral director in New York State. Okay. And passed away was her father-in-law.
Oh.
Wanted to be there she didn't think that she could do the entire embalming herself, but she wanted to be present to assist with it. And honestly, that is the only time I've ever had somebody ask. I have more people ask to do their loved one's hair or to dress them, or to do their makeup than I ever have, like I said, just that one time with the actual embalming process.
I feel like that's more than a lot of people want to take on, unless it's maybe religious or something, or
Yeah, like I've had a lot of I've served Hindu families where they come in and they'll wash the body, but
yeah.
it's not an invasive procedure. They just come in and, wash their loved one. So
Yeah. Or Mormons will come and do a bathing and dress them in their burial outfit and everything, kind of that same thing. But yeah, I don't know that I've had, aside from funeral directors, anybody who's wanted to be there for the embalming part of it.
I have had families ask me, like, actually just last week, we had a woman come to the funeral home and she was dropping off her father's clothes and she asked to see her dad. And we told her, he is on the table right now. We do have him covered. Um, we could show him because he was the only one room, so it wasn't like we were submitting other people's loved ones and that personal time to her. And we actually allowed her, we didn't bring her into the embalming room, but we brought her dad out into another room that we had in the funeral home, and she saw him just kind of lying covered and was asking a ton of questions about the embalming process and was very interested in it. But I don't think she would have wanted to be present. I think she was just interested in it after the fact for us to explain it.
Because I think people want to know what has happened or is going to happen to their loved one, but don't really want to see it in, the actual full process of it. So,
yeah, they're good at education and finding out exactly what it entails, but they don't necessarily have to witness it.
Right. Okay, Marie wants to know, I do have a couple questions. What if this is more, I think, directed towards me because it's a Michigan thing, but what if the deceased has signed off to be cremated and the next of kin, in this case the daughter, is against it? Would the daughter have to get a court order to change the will? Would it make a difference if dad prepaid for it in advance or if daughter was paying for funeral arrangements? Would the next of kin who is making the arrangements have the last say in what is to happen to the body? So in Michigan, and you can share what happens in New York as well after. So in Michigan, up until about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, it was very strict. It was a next of kin order. So it was a spouse, then a majority of the children, and then it went down from there. There was no going above, no going around, anything. Well, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, they came up with that form. So anybody, I can go in and say, I want Little Miss Funeral to dictate what happens to me when I die. That supersedes everything. That you can go in and make my full arrangements, and my family cannot go against your wishes for me by law. So it sounds like in this situation, the deceased has signed off to be cremated. So Marie, we need to know how they signed off to be cremated, because you cannot sign for your own cremation because you are dead and cannot authorize something for yourself at the time, and you can't sign ahead for cremation. So if the daughter is the legal next of kin and that person has not given the authorization to somebody else, and the daughter is the only daughter and there's no spouse, then that daughter dictates what happens. So you don't need a court order, you don't need anything. The deceased basically has given up their right by dying to what they have for themselves. How does it work in New York?
It's basically identical. So in New York, we have a form that's called the appointment of agent to control disposition. It's a form that you can download online and fill out yourself. You don't need a funeral director or anybody to fill it out, but it's the same thing. So in New York State, we have a level of who can control a disposition. The first person is anybody who fills out this form. And then it goes to, like you said, a spouse, children, parents, siblings, so on and so forth, until they can find some sort of a family member. So once again, in New York State, you cannot sign any cremation paperwork ahead of time for
Right.
yourself. So you can go to a funeral home and you can prearrange your funeral, and you can say, I want to have a cremation, and you can prepay it. But really, if you want to make certain that those wishes are going to be followed, you're going to want to fill out this agent form and select somebody who you know is going to follow through with your wishes.
Right.
If you have 3 kids and you know one of those kids do not want you to be cremated, fill out this form and name one of your other children to handle, and they take precedence over everybody else in the family then. So it's kind of going to your state and figuring out what paperwork you can or cannot fill out ahead of time, and making certain that you take the appropriate steps that you can within your state to ensure that you're going to be getting the funeral service that you want.
Well, and I think a lot of people think, well, I'm going to write a will, and they're going to put it in their will.
I
Well,
always
a lot of people they don't file their will appropriately at the court, which it doesn't mean anything until it's filed appropriately. And your will is not read until weeks after your death. So if
Yeah.
you put in there that you want to be cremated or whatever, unless you've given a copy to your family so that they know those wishes ahead of time, the reading of your will does nothing for your disposition. And that's where it's this Hollywoodized version, I think, of all this stuff that, oh, mom died this morning, let's have a reading of her will as we sit around before we
Yeah.
go make arrangements. And that's just not how it works. So there's so much misinformation about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I do too. I kind of laugh about that because.
And sometimes people also think like just writing down your wishes at home, like on a piece of paper, is going to be sufficient enough. I had an aunt who passed away about 2 years ago, and she honestly put down like on a little notepad, my last will and testament, and wrote out exactly what she wanted. And she had cancer. So when she was kind of getting bad with everything and she stopped her chemo, I sat down and I talked with her, and I was like, you should have talked to me before this, because the paperwork that you wrote down literally means nothing. Like if somebody were to find it, you can't just write down this is what I want and hope that it's going to hold up in a court of law or hold up within your state or the funeral home and things like that.
Like, it's nice that that wishes are written down that way and that they're signed, so your family knows if they do have that, or if you give that to your funeral home, so that way when the family comes in and sits down, they can read what you did want, and they can, if there was no bad will amongst the family, they can hopefully follow what your wishes were or find a middle ground like we've talked about. But yeah, I think people think it's legally binding in some way, and it's not at all.
Yeah.
So Linda, why do most obituaries not include the cause of death?
I think that a lot of times the cause of death, two different things. Number one, a lot of times people want to keep the cause of death more personal. They don't want to tell the world what their loved one had died from. And sometimes they just don't know. Sometimes, the death notice and the obituaries are written out and submitted before a family will get a death certificate. So they may not know the actual cause of death when they're writing it. I know that a lot of times people are getting with the huge drug epidemic that is sweeping the country, people are putting cause of deaths in obituaries more if it has to do with a drug related death, just to educate people and try to get others out there who are battling that help. But most of the time families, unless it was something that was known, like mom battled cancer for 4 years and everybody knew she battled cancer. So and it want to write, after a courageous battle, we want to write something like that. Most families just find that they want to keep that more to themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a society of gawkers now where people do put so much out there on Facebook and then on all social media. And so it's just another spot where people expect to know everything is maybe in that obituary. And it's like, what do you mean you're not going to tell me everything I want? Or I also get families that are like, well, we want to put this as the memorial donation place, but we don't want people to assume that's what they died from.
Yeah.
You know, that maybe diabetes was important to them and they had always contributed, but they don't want to put that because they don't want people to assume that they died from that. And so there's like this, you know, kind of decision making on how they're going to word everything so that there's not misinformation and people aren't guessing and people aren't making up stories. And we recently had around here, a young boy had died, and the parents actually published later a letter in the newspaper addressing his death, because there was so much gossip going around about how he died and why he died and what had happened and stuff. And so they just finally said, screw it. And they put out this letter to educate other kids and to try and help, like you said, kind of taking that next step and lifting the veil, making sure nobody can talk from that point on, and just here it is kind of thing. And but like you said, you know, it's mom died from coronary artery disease. It doesn't really flow in an obituary, and so you just leave it out. If they're 90 years old, who cares? If the, you know, they're old, they died. Why does it matter if it was, you know, dementia related? Or
I think this is a good question too for the public, just because since we do live in an age of like social media and people always knowing other people's business, that when someone dies, it really is not anybody's business other than the family what they died from. Like, you can't just call a home and say, oh, I see Mrs. Smith died. What happened? Like,
and they do.
We cannot tell you what happened. We cannot tell you what the death certificate says. That information, you know, is information for the family and for the next of kin. And as a society, it's not our job to know everything, but it's our job to be able to be there for others and support them. And if they want to confide in us what mom died from, then that's fine. But you never go and ask what happened. That's not what a family needs at the time of a passing.
Well, you know, a lot of times there's times where suicide families, nobody knows. They just say, oh, they died at home in their sleep, or, you know, it just never comes out. But the funeral home staff knows. But those people, like you said, that are asking, like, what happened to them? What happened to them? It's not like we're going to divulge. We don't work by a HIPAA. And I've had that question actually recently a couple times. What about HIPAA? How can you tell? We don't abide by HIPAA. There's no such thing in the funeral business, but we have, you know, morals and standards, and so we can't just tell you information that's not public information. Whatever's on a death certificate is public information. You can go get a death certificate for any person at the county that they died at any time. So if someone's really interested, go get their death certificate, pay the, you know, whatever amount that county charges, and get the death certificate, and you can get any information that's off of there. But beyond that, we can't give you, you know, information at a funeral home. Like you said, it's, stop asking. Not gonna happen. Sharon asks, my question is it better to be buried in an unsealed casket, assuming this will allow air in so the deceased will not explode or turn liquefied? Also, then, should we bury our loved ones in a lined or waterproof vault or a standard one? So I know we've talked a little about this, but I guess what is your personal opinion on this?
Okay, so I go back and forth, because when I die, I want to be buried, and my entire family knows I want to be buried. In my community right now, we don't have any green cemeteries. So for me personally, if I were to die today, that's not an option for me. I tend to think that if I were to pass away, for me, I wouldn't care, because I'm dead. You know, I don't care if my family purchases a vault that seals or a casket that seals. I know a lot of funeral directors out there are going to tell you, no, you need a sealer casket and a sealer vault because those are more expensive. So a funeral home makes more money if you purchase those items, but they're not a necessity. They really aren't.
No.
Unless you deem that important. People will always pay for what they find value in. So I have some families who walk into the funeral home and they want a casket that seals. They want a vault that is triple lined, that, you know, when you bury it, no water, no elements is getting into that casket. And for them, that is the right thing to do, because that's what they want, and that's what they
feel. Yeah, it's
And it's not my job to tell somebody what is better or not better. It's my job to give them all of the information and give them all of the options so that they can make a decision. So for me personally, actually, I kind of lied because at the funeral home that I currently work, I do have one casket picked out where if I were to die today, that's the one that I would want because I just like how it looks, and it's a sealer casket. But if it came in a non-sealed option too, that would be fine for me. But it's such a personal question, and you have to look at your family, you have to look at your values, you have to look at your financial situation and pick something that works best for all of that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, that's my favorite casket is a wood casket. And that's just the casket I like. It's what I've always been drawn to, and it still is probably my favorite casket thinking about caskets. And wood caskets don't seal. So to me, that's not important that the casket seals. It's that it's a casket that I want and that I feel connected to for some reason. You know, people pick caskets because they look like the wood in their kitchen, or there's one that looks like the butt of the hunting rifle. You know, it's the same wood and the same grain that the gentleman's hunting rifle, or it looks like the cabin they went to, or, you know, the color of their car that they loved, or, you know, there's some connection. There's something that speaks to people about the casket. But the vault, to me, the vault matters. Like I want to be in a ceiling, like, lock me in there so tight that nothing's getting to me. But I also have such a fear about going, I don't know, I have a death fear anyway, which is crazy when you work in the business, but I don't think anything in the business can alleviate your fear of it if you have
But
it.
it's not crazy though, because death is a natural part of life, but it's so unknown. Like, we've never had anybody, you know, that we know and
come back.
okay guys, this is what happens, don't worry about it. You know, it's like people die, and depending on your religious beliefs and your faith, it's like you are going to have different ideas as to what happens with yourself, right? So it's such a personal decision. Like, my mother wants to be cremated. She tells me, and I believe her, that if I do not cremate her, she will haunt me because she does not want to be in the ground. And that's just my mom's fear. You know, she wants to be cremated, and she's fine like putting her cremated remains in a mausoleum or scattering them, but she does not want me to bury her cremated remains in the ground. And it's understandable. We all have fears. We all have different thoughts on the matter. So, you know, it just depends.
To each his own.
Yes.
So here's our last question of this round. Question about online live streaming funerals. Is this allowed? Have you ever been involved with a funeral that was live streamed with families spread across the country and around the world? It's often not practical or possible to travel for a funeral. So what's been your...
Yes. So the very first funeral home, not the very first funeral home, because I worked for a funeral home while I was in college. But when I was first licensed, I'll put it that way, that I worked for, the funeral director and owner actually would record the funeral services. Now, they weren't live streamed, but he came up with this idea years ago because he had a military family, or a family member who was in the military, and their grandmother passed away, and they were not allowed to come back to the funeral home to be there for their grandmother's service. So he thought it would be a great idea to be able to offer the service to people in different situations, for whatever they may be. So what we would always do is we would record the funeral services, you know, while they were going on, and then upload them later that day. So they weren't live, but family and friends could watch the services the same day, just a couple of hours later. And he got a lot of positive feedback on it for military families, or even, I remember we had some families who were out of the country and they just couldn't get a flight, couldn't get back for whatever reason. So all the experience that I've had with it has been very positive.
I've never done like a live stream where the whole, well, I take that back. We had a very public funeral and they live streamed it on the news for that day.
Yeah.
Aside from that, we've never live streamed it on like a website or anything, but I have done where we Skype the funeral, we're Skyping or FaceTiming the funeral for one or two family members who can't be there, something like that. And and it's worked well. The only problem is you have to have a staff member who's dedicated, kind of sitting and making sure it's working properly and that the person can hear and that they're muted, or the family member is kind of doing it themselves. When my grandma died in Minnesota, we went there for the funeral, and my brother, his girlfriend at the time, couldn't be there, and so we FaceTimed, you know, so he's sitting there with the phone making sure she can hear the funeral, and of course he accidentally unmuted her during this like part where my aunt was telling us that my grandma had bought each of us a Bible and had wrote this like inscription to each of us and passed them out at the funeral to all us grandkids. And so all of a sudden in the middle, you hear my brother's girlfriend at the time go, "Oh my God." Like it was just this emotional moment. But it was so funny because it was so quiet, and all of a sudden you hear her come out of the blue. So I think there's, you know, it's one of those things that could happen anyway if she was sitting right there, but you can have some snafus with the technology portion of it because of like the muting and stuff, but it's going to happen regardless. But I think it's nice to be able to include, because there's a lot of people who can't get away. They can't financially, like you said, fly there, or, you know, you can't get off work for aunts, uncles anymore to go to their funerals. You can't get off work for cousins, for in-laws and things like that. Even if you're in the same town, you can't get off work because it's just not allowed. So to be able to at least maybe sit at your desk and see the funeral, or I love that recording and uploading it so people can watch it later. That's awesome. That's really
I can't remember the name of I'm pretty certain we did it through a name. I haven't been with that funeral home for about 5 years now. And I can't remember, but I'm pretty certain that he worked through a company because we always gave the family a choice. They could make it public or they could make it private. So if they made it private, they could choose like a username and a password, and then they would pass that out to just, you know, whoever they wanted. So, you know, a random person couldn't log on the website and just.
That's really cool.
It was, and I'll see if I can find the name of the company, and then maybe we can like include it in this or something.
That would be cool.
It didn't help people unless it was the funeral home that was going through it.
Yeah.
But it was really good.
That's cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for our first series of Q&A with Little Miss Funeral and Kari. I love, like, you have this awesome name. I remember when I started into this, I thought about like, okay, what could my name be? And I was like, screw it, I'm just going to be Kari. Like,
I should have done that, but I started my blog so long ago that.
Fun doing that. So that's, if you do not follow her blog or follow her on Facebook or follow her on YouTube, go subscribe. Check her out, check out her website, and read some of her stuff. It's amazing. You guys will learn so much with her stuff. And by all means, subscribe, check out my stuff if you don't either. We're cross-referencing subscribers and viewers here, so I love it. We're kind of bringing together the people. So we will catch you guys soon for our next series of 10 questions. By all means, post questions below and keep us going with answering them. And we will talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Bye.